Happy New Year, hello, and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg. I am here today to finally begin my wrap up for the year 2019. I know it is already 2020. I took a bit of a long weekend to kind of relax before I had to get back to work today and take some time, enjoy life, enjoy the last parts of the holidays. You can see Christmas is officially over. We took our tree down, we took our decorations down, which makes me sad, but it'll come around again. And, you know, it is what it is. So I thought the best way to kick off my 2019 wrap-up would be to start with the books that were my favorite reads of 2019. Now, of course, these don't have to be books that were new in 2019, just books that were new to me. Things that I read within the year and enjoyed. They can be rereads, although this year none of my favorites are rereads. They are all books that were new to me. I will follow this up with my least favorite books of 2019. And some kind of also ran some books that I really liked enough to spotlight, but which did not make this list of my favorite reads of the year. And of course, after that, I will start wrapping up my 2019 goals and talk about my 2020 goals, which I have already figured out. But let's get started with this. So I have my two favorites and my number one favorite. But other than that, I'm not really going to rank the books that I'm going to talk about. I just really liked them, and I didn't want to put the rest of the list into a numbered ranking. So, you know, it's my channel, I can do what I want. So there it is. So let's start with the ones that I do not have copies of, just to kick things off somewhere. Let's talk about Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell, which I listened to on audiobook. This was something that I got on my reading list because of Westover, and I'm so glad I did. So thank you, Westover, for that. Elizabeth Gaskell is an author I have heard a lot about over the years, but had never read before, and I am definitely looking forward to reading more of her books. If you are unfamiliar with Cranford, it is a story about women living in the town of Cranford in the time period in which it was published, which obviously, if you are familiar with Westover, you can guess. And it is just such a good book. It follows a sort of episodic structure. I don't know for a fact, but I know a lot of books were serialized back in the day, and you can definitely see how this one would have been as well, because each chapter is basically a story that could almost stand alone, but when you put them together, it creates this marvelous tapestry of the town of Cranford and the women who live in it, and the changes over time, and just their lives and the way they live. There are parts of it that just really hit me right in the heart. I thought it was really wonderful. I thought it was funny. So well written. The characters were great. It is fantastic. If you're a fan of authors like Jane Austen or Edith Wharton, I think Elizabeth Gaskell would definitely be for you. I can't wait to check out more of her books in 2020 and beyond. Then there is a nonfiction book that I got from the library. I actually discovered this because of Simon Savage over at Savage Reads. It is The Five by Hallie Rubenhold. This book is really interesting because it's a history book. It is also kind of a true crime book. But unlike most true crime books, it is not focused on the killer. It is about the victims of Jack the Ripper, but it really takes the focus away from Jack the Ripper. And in doing so, it puts the focus on not just the victims, but the women who live in the time period in which he lived and committed these crimes, and in which they lived, more importantly. And it talks about their lives, and you can really get a sense of what it was like to be a woman in the time. And it talks about in the ways that their lives were misrepresented in the public and have continued to be misrepresented. You start to get a sense of how history looks at women and their role in the world, and how in piecing together the fragments of their life for you, you also get a sense of what it is to study history and how difficult it is to study history, because for so many of these women, since they were lower class, there are really just fragments, and you can only piece together how they lived based on marriage records, death certificates, things like that, and when they checked into workhouses. And the book talks very much about workhouses, and you get a really great sense of the time period. Not from, usually when you see this time period, you get it from the higher levels of society. So it's really good to get a sense of the more gritty part of the world in which most people lived, let's be honest. And it's just so good. And it goes with this idea of giving these women their stories back, because they have been defined as victims of Jack the Ripper. But they were women who had lives and stories and passions and goals of their own. and Hallie Rubenhold wants to give those back to them, and I think she does a beautiful job of it. It's such a good book. I highly recommend it if you are interested in history, if you're interested in stories of women, even if you're interested in true crime. I think this is a very good, fresh perspective on the true crime genre, and one that I hope more authors take notice of and continue in the future, because I do also think that even in sensational crimes like the crimes of Jack the Ripper, it's important to remember that the victims had lives, and to kind of give them a little bit of honor and dignity and truth if we can. So that's all. Then another nonfiction book, this one I listened to on audio, is Educated by Tara Westover. This is also kind of a harrowing book. It has a lot of potential triggers in terms of like abuse and violence and trauma, particularly child abuse and things like that. So it can be difficult to read if those are trigger points for you. However, it is a really good book. So Tara Westover grew up in a family. Her father was a very domineering, abusive presence in the family, and he would not let her go to school because he thought school was going to brainwash her. He would not let her go to the hospital or to doctors because he thought that doctors were part of the system and would poison you. And she lived this life. They were kind of an offshoot, cult-ish family and very religious. And she eventually decided to send herself to school, and did well enough that she eventually got into Cambridge and became very educated, as the title suggests. It is such a good book. I love her personal journey. I think one of the interesting things about it is, if you know me at all, if you followed along, I love narratives where the author is kind of interrogating themselves and their history or their past or their family. And this is definitely that. She definitely... her family has publicly said that things are not the way she presented them in the book, but I feel like even in the book, she tries very hard to think about the perspective of her family and to present their side of the story and think about it and question herself about, why do I think about this differently? Why do I remember this differently? And so I feel like, even though they naturally disagree with the way she presents events, I feel like the way she presents things is actually extremely fair and open and just honest. I feel like I trust her. And it's just a really good book. If you can stomach the queasier parts of its being, I would definitely recommend it. It is a very good book. And then another nonfiction book that I listened to on audio was Maid by Stephanie Land. Now, part of why I like this book is that her ultimate goal in this book is to move to Missoula, which is where I live. So that's not a kind of narrative you usually see in a book, so I really appreciated that. But basically, the reason I love this book so much is that it talks about, basically Stephanie Land was poor and became pregnant and decided to keep her baby. And then she ended up breaking up with the father of the baby, and then ended up on her own. And it's about the struggles to survive and get by in this country. And it's about how once you are at the lowest rung of the economic ladder, how hard it is to pick yourself back up and start to do better, because she's genuinely trying a lot of the time, but she just can't get ahead. For instance, she wants to find a job, but you need a car to have a lot of the jobs that she needed to get as a maid. You need to be able to transport yourself. And her entire livelihood depends on this car, but she has to keep putting money into it because it needs gas, it needs maintenance. So she can't ever really spend money on housing or food or anything like that. And it's just, it's things that I think most people don't think about unless they have also had struggles with money. And I have had struggles with money in my life. So there are definitely parts of this book that ring true and that I hope people will read and experience, because I think another thing that happens in society is that people blame the person who's going through these financial troubles for what's happened to them. And they can be trying very hard. And like even her parents move her out of a homeless shelter where she had been living with her daughter. And that very day they expected her to pay for lunch because they helped her move. And it's like, and they have no sympathy for her and the circumstances in which she is in. So I just think this is kind of an important book. And I hope that people will read it, discover it, and really listen to Stephanie Land's story, because it rings true from my own personal experience. And I'm very glad that I did not have the more extreme aspects of her story to deal with on as well. So Now let's move into some of the books that I have copies of, and let's start with a graphic memoir called The Best We Could Do by an author whose name I'm going to butcher. It's Thi Bui. I'm sorry. I've been talking about this book since roughly June, and I still haven't figured out how to pronounce the author's name. However, this is absolutely a wonderful book. Basically, the author is looking back at her family and the trauma that her family experienced as a result of the Vietnam War and the chaos and tumult in Vietnam leading up to and during and even after the Vietnam War. And she immigrated as a very young child, and she is very much interrogating her own dual citizenship, how she was raised here, but she's still very much tied through her family to Vietnam. And she's trying to understand her parents and the things that they went through. I just think it's an absolutely beautiful book. I very highly recommend it. The illustrations are really good. They are all in this color scheme that you see here, the whites, the blacks, and all the different shades of this kind of orangey red. It is just, I highly recommend this book. It's one of those things that's right up my alley because, as I said, I love a book where the author is interrogating their own past or their family's past. And that's very much what the author is doing here. It's so good. And I love that the idea of lingering trauma, how the things that happened to her parents impacted her. And the framework for this is that I'm not going to butcher her name again, but the author has just become a mother herself when she is publishing this, and she is afraid of repeating the traumas that were inflicted on her as a result of her parents' traumas on her own children. And I think it's a beautiful book. I love it. And I think you will too, if you would give it a chance. Then let's talk about The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. This is a book that I really liked when I first read it, but the more I think about it, the more it grows in my estimation, especially since this was Toni Morrison's first book, and she basically just emerges fully formed as a writer. I think there are some aspects of this book that really develop in her later writing, and in that way you can tell that it is her first book. However, it is so good that it almost doesn't even matter. It's just astonishing. So this is the story of a little girl who is black and poor and dreams of having blue eyes because she thinks if she could just have blue eyes, this one ideal form of beauty, everything would be okay. But obviously that's kind of a childish dream, and these horrible things happen to her. This is another book that would be full of triggers. It is a beautiful story, but also a very difficult story. But I think because it's a difficult story, it's also one that really needs to be listened to and heard, and I really commend Toni Morrison for telling it. This was only the second book that I had read by Toni Morrison. I read it in the wake of her death in 2019, and I'm really looking forward to reading more books by her in the future. Now, the next one is something that I read really early on in the year and just stayed with me throughout 2019. It's The Gifts of the Body by Rebecca Brown. Interestingly, this is a really short book. It is only 159 pages. It is still in print, but I had to order it from a local independent bookstore, and they were able to get it. It took like 3 or 4 weeks. But I would definitely recommend that you do the same because this is a book that deserves to be discovered. It was originally published in, I want to say 1994. But I could be wrong about that. It is 1994. So Rebecca Brown, the author, had worked as a home health care worker for people who were living with AIDS and dying of AIDS. At the time, 1994, there were not treatments for AIDS that could make it something that you live with and that you can manage in the course of your life. Basically, at that time period, a diagnosis of HIV was largely still a death sentence. So Rebecca Brown had worked as a home health care worker. This novel follows an unnamed home health care worker who deals with AIDS patients who are dying. And I was not sure I liked this book in the beginning because it feels very cold. There's a bit of a distance, and I wasn't so sure about that. But roughly halfway through, you start to realize what Rebecca Brown is doing. That distance, that sort of cold remove that you feel is because it is a safety device. It is something that this home health care worker needs in order to do her job, in order to get by. Because, you get introduced to a lot of these patients in the beginning, and then they start dying. A lot of them come back or have died by the end, and you start to realize that it's a very difficult job, and she needs that protective barrier, but it starts coming down, and it's just a beautiful book. It's about life and death and how to live and how to help people live and die. It's a beautiful book. It's a difficult book, but I absolutely love it. I think it is worth bringing back, not just as a time capsule, but as, there are people, it's not just, I would say, for people living with HIV or AIDS. It could also apply to like cancer and things like that, any kind of long-term illness. And one thing I also like about it is that Rebecca Brown very much does not go along with the idea of HIV or AIDS as a gay problem. She also has heterosexual people, heterosexual women who have it. It's just a very good book that I am very glad I discovered and very glad I read. This popped up in my recommendations after I read and loved The Great Believers by Rebecca Makkai, and I recommend it to you as well. Next is a book that really took me by surprise. I did not expect to like this as much as I did. It's Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Now, interestingly, once I read this and loved it as much as I did, I looked into the rest of Taylor Jenkins Reid's books and did not really feel attached to the idea of reading any of them. And in fact, since I decided not to pursue any of her other books, I've heard some kind of negative things that made me feel okay about that, about her other books. However, and I can see where some people have criticisms of this book, I really enjoyed it. So basically, it is the story of a rock band in the 70s that is loosely to closely based on Fleetwood Mac and the creation of their Rumors album, which is largely considered to be one of the masterpiece albums of all time, even though the band Fleetwood Mac was largely splintering and falling apart as they made it. And that is basically what is happening here, except this band is... So the Six was a band. Daisy Jones was a singer on her own. The music label kind of forced them to team up to create an album. And in the process of creating it, they fight, they love, they create this beautiful classic, or destined to be classic, music. There's a lot of drug use and addiction. There are a lot of, the typical classic, behind the music moments. But for some reason, I just felt captivated by all of it. I really enjoyed it. I will say I thought the ending was very clunky. There's a sort of twist at the end that I didn't think was necessary. I don't think adds anything to the book. I won't spoil anything here. I will just note that the story is told in the style of an oral history. If you're unfamiliar with oral history, it is where the narrative goes back and forth between people who are telling bits and pieces of the story. You can see right here we have Graham, Billy, Warren, back to Billy, back to Graham, back to Billy. And they're not talking to each other. It's almost as if they're all doing interviews and then they've been spliced together. And I can see where some people wouldn't enjoy that. I have actually always loved the idea of a novel in the form of an oral history, so it was great to see it executed. And I think it was done really well. I was genuinely surprised by how much I enjoyed this book. Now let's get into my two favorites. And we'll start with the runner-up, which any other year would have been my favorite book easily. It's A Fine Balance by Rohinton Mistry. And I struggled all year. I was going back and forth between the top two books, and on any given day, I might have said this one, I might have said the other one. But as the year has progressed, the other book just got more of an edge, and it had a bit more of a personal connection than A Fine Balance. But I absolutely love this book. The back of the book actually says that it recalls the work of Charles Dickens. I kind of agree with that. So this book is set in India in 1975, and it's a part of history that I had not known about. The Prime Minister at the time, who is unnamed in the book, but of course we know is Indira Gandhi, declares a state of emergency, and she does this so that she can create all of these really cruel laws, and a lot of people just disappear. It's a time of great upheaval, especially if you are not someone who is in power. And it tells the story of four people whose lives come together and who try to get through this time. The way the blurb on the back of it ends is that A Fine Balance creates an enduring panorama of the human spirit in an inhuman state. I absolutely believe that. I don't think you can describe this book in any better way. It is a very deeply humane book, even though there are tragic things happen all over the time. However, it is also funny. It is also very touching and heartfelt, so don't worry about it being super bleak if that is something that you would be concerned about. I absolutely recommend this book to you. It is so good. And now let's get into the number one. If you have followed this channel this year, it's not going to be a surprise to you at all, because even in my mid-year checkpoint, it was between A Fine Balance and A Place for Us by Fatima, Farheen, Mirza, and I even chose this one back in June, and it's still my number one. It is so good, and that is all the more astonishing because this is a debut novel, and it is so well written, so well plotted. The characters are so deep. Everything about this book is just exquisite. It is the story of a fractured family. Basically, the premise of the book is that the eldest daughter of the family is getting married, and she invites her estranged brother, who has not seen the family for a couple of years at that time, to the wedding, and he agrees to go. And that is the framework for it to go back and tell the stories and shift perspectives among members of the family to reveal other sides of the story. You frequently see the same scenario played out from the different perspectives of people in the family, which sounds like a gimmick, but the way Fatima Farheen Mirza does it is so good. I absolutely love everything about this book. It is also particularly interesting because this is a Muslim family, and it very much deals with that, with the religion of the family, and the eldest daughter and the other daughter have to decide at what point they are going to wear scarves and cover themselves up, if they're going to wear scarves and cover themselves up. It's, on so many levels, this is a really good book. What really got me, I think, so much is that, and one thing I really love about this book is that when you see it praised on BookTube, everybody latches on to a different aspect of the book, and none of those are wrong. And I think that's one of the most interesting things, seeing what about this book grabs somebody. And for me, it's the last part of the book. Now, no spoilers, I will not give anything away, but throughout the book, the father of the family is kind of kept at a distance. He's the only perspective that you don't get as you find out the story of how they came to be fractured. And in the end, you finally hear his perspective, and that's what got me. And I won't say anything more about it. I just think it's absolutely beautiful. And I think one of the things that's really so good about this is that Fatima Farheen Mirza understands that it's usually the small cracks that lead to a big fracture in a family. There doesn't necessarily have to be one inciting incident, although there is one thing that kind of breaks, a straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak. But she understands that it can be a lot of small things that lead to it, and it could be a lot of misunderstandings. And I think that's another thing that just got me in particular. I absolutely love this book. I look forward to rereading this in a couple of years and seeing how my perspective on it might shift. Because another thing I've really become attuned to in the last few years is how, as you age and go through life, you respond to different things in books that you previously liked. You may dislike a book you previously liked. You may like a book you previously disliked. And I really look forward to checking in with this book again in a couple of years and seeing how where I am at in life at that point makes me respond to it differently. And if you have read this, I would love to hear what it is about this that you responded to. If you don't like it, by the way, please let me know that as well. So there you go. Those are my favorite books that I read in 2019. All of them were new to me this year. If you have read any of these, I would love to hear your opinion, even if you disagree with me. If you have any recommendations based on these, I would love to hear that as well. And I would love to also hear what your favorite reads from 2019 were. Drop those in the comments down below. You know what to do. I will be back with my least favorite reads of 2019 and some kind of also-rans, just because I don't think they didn't make my favorites, but I still kind of want to talk about them. So I will come back with those, and then I'll talk about my reading goals, wrapping up 2019, and my new goals for 2020. So until then, thank you for your time watching this video. As always, it is really appreciated. I am really touched that so many of you have followed along in my first year on BookTube. I'm looking forward to more in my second year on BookTube, and I'll be back. Until then, happy reading.